We should get into it while you've still got power in your computer, Ben.
Yeah, let's do it.
Try not to run any other apps at the same time if you could. Turn off Snapchat.
I'll turn off uTorrent. We'll turn off VLC.
Oh my God, what is all this? Is this the dark web?
It's the intellectual dark web.
Tēnā koutou katoa, this is Gone By Lunchtime. It is Tuesday, the 5th of March. We're talking about 9:45, and Belly Mather is here with me, just there. I can see her. Kia ora.
Kia ora.
Ben Thomas is in Wellington, currently chugging on a large can of soda pop, and excitingly last you said 43% left on your laptop, which you don't have a charger for, Ben. What do you got now?
41.
Okay, so we're
but
really...
to be fair, that's probably about 5 minutes. That's probably about 5 minutes. So
yeah.
I think
we're
good to go.
The first 20 takes a long time. The last 40 can go catastrophically quickly.
I always think it's good to have some jeopardy, a sense of danger.
Yeah, it really, you can tell that the ears are pricking up around the nation as they listen to this podcast, wondering, will Ben make it to the end? He'll probably be cut off mid-extended metaphor. Every
political take should be delivered as if it's your last breath and the last opportunity of the public to hear what you have to say.
We're going to talk today about Christopher Luxon and the entitlement Premier House debacle, about the burst of activity and urgency in Parliament, about the opposition response, and a word on Grant Robertson. But this morning, Christopher Luxon, as we speak, has flown to Melbourne for a sort of little bonus ASEAN summit that Albanese is hosting. On a commercial flight, he had to go via Auckland because the 757, the NZDF77, dear old thing, has once again had a little bit of a difficult night.
It's broken.
Just not feeling up to it, frankly.
It's broken.
It's uninhabitable. It needs maintenance. And what? Do you vipers want him to buy his own seat to Australia?
He's saying, are you guys all going to give me a hard time because the taxpayer has paid for my Air New Zealand flight to Melbourne because the state of the plane? I feel sorry for him a bit. Like you go promise this new job, exciting new job, big job, Prime Minister of New Zealand, comes with a house and a plane. You walk in, you're right. They're both absolute dogs. No go, no dice.
He should go for a low carbon hang glider, I reckon.
Yeah. Or just do it all by Zoom from his one of his 4 or 5 houses in Auckland. You know, that's the future, isn't it? Isn't that what we're all doing? That's what you're doing, Ben. How many % have you got, Ben?
Still 41.
Oh, right. We're rocking. This is good. Let's talk about that then, the Premier House thing. Annabelle, sort of the story began in a way I'd like to think with Usman Khawaja, the Australian opener, lovely man, who told Ben Mackay, Australian Associated Press reporter, during a function at Premier House in the lead up to the first test between New Zealand and Australia at the Basin Reserve, he told him that Christopher Luxon had told him, Khawaja, that the house was condemned, the Premier House was condemned, and then Team Luxon rushed to say, no, we didn't actually say that, we just said that it was getting some maintenance done. It seemed like the truth was somewhere in between, probably that the idea was basically it's uninhabitable. Anyway, then we had the release of the various expenses and claims and whatnot on the part of politicians. Mark Dolder managed to get the story on Friday morning that Christopher Luxon was claiming the housing entitlement, the housing allowance of $52,000 a year. He'd begun claiming that because Premier House just wasn't in a state that he felt that he could live there, though he wanted to live there. As the day wore on, there was various coverage, some of it quite damning, some harks back to old mate Bill English and his situation when he was claiming a housing allowance despite living in his pad in Karori. And then Luxon did a stand-up in Queenstown, little media conference, 3 p.m, and he sort of looked a bit startled, and he made the mistake of using the word entitled about 3,000 or 4,000 times. He said, I'm entitled to my entitlement, much as he's previously said.
He said, I'm entitled to my entitlement like everyone else is entitled.
Like everyone else, like you and me.
Right, well, just like he previously said that it's part of the process of being part of the process, which is it's straightforward. What is wrong with people that they can't see this?
Indeed.
And this went on 15 minutes. And then he went and got in his car and he was briefed by his advisors.
By News Talk ZB, wasn't it?
Well, that's right, because come 4:30, I listened back because I wanted to see if there were any talkback callers, like whether it was Colin from Gore who had changed the course of history. There were some texts, but at 4:30, Heather du Plessis-Allen says, we've had the Prime Minister wants to come on and talk about this. So it was by 4:30, the decision had been made. So between 3:15 and 4:30, the decision was made. Christopher Luxon came on and said, look, it's clearly a distraction. I was being briefed. I've been told that you, Heather, and Kerry Woodham had been talking about it, and the talkback radio has spoken. He said, it's of the talkback, by the talkback, for the talkback, and this has become a distraction, and he would not be claiming the entitlement to which he was entitled. No go.
I'd love to use a cricket pun, but I haven't got any. I don't know anything about cricket. But what I can say is that he has tested positive for entitleitis.
Yes.
And unfortunately was not able to self-diagnose early enough.
Yes.
It's becoming an unfortunate pattern with him. We've had, the Tesla debacle and this and a few other bits and pieces. And it does make me wonder what sort of advice he's getting. We've had the cut and paste speech at Waitangi, now this. But, and the reality is that Luxon should be able to rely on his own nous to identify how hypocritical this situation would read. The other issue that it raises is how out of touch he is with the lives of our poorest citizens in this country. He's saying that Premier House is uninhabitable at a time when we have people living in cars, living in horrendous emergency housing situations, living in lean-tos and tents all around the country. So it doesn't speak well for the Prime Minister if you're having to listen to News Talk ZB to realise that being entitled to your entitlement at the same time that you're slashing projects in schools, potentially slashing school lunches, slashing benefits is not a good look.
That timing, Ben, did make it, as Annabelle says, even more problematic, even more acute in terms of its sense of, walking the talk.
That's right. It's time to tighten the belt. There's no more free rides.
People are treating New Zealand like a bottomless ATM. All of that. What's going on? What's going on that from a political management point of view, from a risk management point of view, this wasn't stopped? Apart from anything else, he doesn't need the money. There's the old adage, the old WWJKD, what would John Key do? What John Key did is he strained in the other direction such that Michael Cullen's rich prick thing didn't land. And I think I was reading somewhere reminded that he would pay for Brona's fares overseas. He donated some of his income to charity. He wanted to make it super clear that he was not suffering from entitleitis.
Clearly far more self-aware.
I think Mad Chapman wrote this in her piece on that Key always struck you as the guy who'd shout your dinner or shout your drinks, and Luxon, he's increasingly sort of seems like the guy who will text you afterwards to be like, here's my bank account number to just get your share. And look, part of me sort of puts it down to the kind of, he comes from business. He comes from being a chief executive. Your pay is, the pay and entitlements are just sort of part of the job. But chief executive pay is something that gets scrutinized by shareholders, and share packages and things like that. So I think it's just a much more sort of prosaic kind of part of his worldview where he sort of thinks, and he's not wrong, that you shouldn't be made worse off by having a job. It shouldn't cost you money to have a job.
But which you could agree with, except that he doesn't even have a mortgage on that place, eh?
Well, this is the thing. It just makes it in a way, it's kind of like when I when I was a kid at primary school, I thought the kid whose parents owned the dairy was so lucky because they had all this fizzy drink and ice cream and chocolate. And
they were.
And you don't see the other and you of course don't see the other side, which is that's not theirs. They're just, they're selling it. They have debts, they have overheads, and and Luxon, there is an opportunity cost. If he's just taking the 52 grand, giving it to another private landlord, like say the Green Superannuation Fund, renting a house off them, then he's missing out on that rent he could have collected from his own palatial apartment. Now, whether he would have been collecting it or whether that would have just been a place for his kids to stay in Wellington when they were there or whatever, I mean, I don't know, but yeah, the problem is trying to explain that to people that actually my seventh house does have an economic value to me to rent out if I'm not in it, even though it's mortgage free. Explaining that to most Kiwis, especially under the current kind of crippling interest rates, the cost of living, all of that kind of thing, and the fact that ultimately we're footing the bill for the 52 grand. It should have been obvious. People have talked about the advice, and it's always difficult to kind of speculate on that, because whenever I speculate out loud about something like that on this, you always hear from somebody going like, actually that was me, and the reason was this, and it was a good call, But the only thing I can put it down to is that he was traveling. He was in Queenstown. He was probably getting text after, I would guess he's getting text after text after phone call from people like Nicola Willis, who was on the 9th floor when Bill English faced a similar kind of travail working in John Key's office. Chris Bishop, who was a ministerial advisor at the time. Julie Ash, I think she was in the firmament in Wellington somewhere, the deputy chief of staff. All of these people, would have been flashing high alert, klaxons going off. And I think maybe it's just the distance or he's far enough away that he's like, oh, no, it's fine. I'll get through it. I'll just bat it away. And it was only sort of after, unfortunately, to extend Annabelle's metaphor, he didn't self-isolate. And unfortunately, he went out there and managed to double down at least one more time before. Well,
I guess he should have been inoculated in advance, shouldn't he? I mean, that's the point, isn't it? That you kind of it's easy to be disapproving and patronising after the fact, isn't it? But is that a hard thing to see coming down the slipway? Is that hard?
Patronising and disapproving before the fact, to be fair.
Yeah. The thing is, I wondered to myself when he was doubling down. I actually second guessed myself, and I thought, maybe the world has changed. It is almost 14 years since Bill English faced this problem. He got absolutely roasted, got crucified. It wasn't a matter of batting it out for a couple of days. It went on for weeks. And it was very difficult for Bill, very difficult for his family. It was, people were calling it a fraud. Things got very heated and nasty. And you could see this going the same way. It's not true. It's not fraudulent. It is an entitlement. But, you could just see it going the same way. And I was like, maybe I'm out of touch. Maybe things have moved on. Maybe attention spans are so different now that he sort of thinks it's kind of the same as the Tesla thing. Just move on, whatever.
He was probably in Canada or Chicago, to be fair, Christopher Luxon, when all of that went down. So, there is perhaps a little bit of not having kind of watched the quotidian realities of New Zealand politics along the way.
Oh, yeah. But I mean, look, this is the fourth term of the John Key government, in many respects, including a lot of personnel. And I can only put it down to Luxon was just sort of seeing this concern coming and going, it's no, that's fine.
The thing is that he's almost a victim of his own success, because he delivered that line, we won't stand for treating New Zealand taxpayers like a bottomless ATM machine, which is a line that, absolutely hit the spot with a lot of people. And so when you're delivering pearlers like that and then at the same time pulling $1,000 a week to live in your own house, that's part of what undid him, I think.
And I mean, weirdly enough, if there were work underway at Premier House in the apartment, then I think it would have been all right. It would have been, well, he's got nowhere else to live. The fact that he could live there, not in comfort and not in nice decor, but he could live there, be like kind of have to get together the cutlery. Lots of the knives would have like spotting marks on them and stuff, when you move into one of those places. Would have been a lot like that. But he would have been able to stay there.
Just finally, it is interesting how the Premier House discussion has now sort of taken on a life of its own. And so in a way, Luxon has succeeded, because now, I saw there was a column by Luke Malpass in Stuff in the Post over the weekend saying, who will have which prime minister will have the political courage to create a palace of Versailles for them to live in? This tricky issue of spending $30 million on the prime minister's residence has been ducked for so long. When is somebody going to have the bravery to say, I will spend $30 million on my personal home?
God. Bring back Vogel House, I say. Last week in Parliament, it was a real whiplash week. There was a lot of urgency. There was a lot of controversial legislation that was rushed through for all stages at urgency, including the reversal of the smoke-free measures, including the repeal of the Māori Health Authority. All that urgency, Ben, I guess it feels as though in opposition, parties say this is completely illegitimate, this is unacceptable, and then in government they go ahead and do it. But was this pushing the kind of boundaries of what's acceptable under urgency? And before you get to that, just quickly, what percentage are you on?
We're tracking at 37%. So pretty good.
Fine. Good. Okay.
Yeah, we could go all day. Okay. Another megapod.
Give us a long lesson about the sort of Jeffrey Palmer length answer on this one, please.
It is true that every opposition accuses every government of misusing urgency, of using it more than they themselves did in government, and they're usually right. I think criticisms of urgency are often overstated because urgency can mean a couple of different things. Sometimes urgency literally just means it's pretty urgent, so we're going to sit extended hours in Parliament. We're going to sit up until midnight. We're going to sit in the morning. We're even going to sit into Friday, but they conduct the business of the House normally. You've got a bunch of third readings you need done. You've got some committees of the whole House that you want to get all the way through rather than sort of stopping and starting. The urgency that's more concerning from a constitutional point of view is where you do all stages urgency, where you sort of miss bits in between. You do a one-day select committee process or no select committee process. You just introduce the bill and suddenly it's the law. And you don't get the kind of checks and balances, some sort of nominal, like second reading speeches, but some very genuine, like select committee processes and committees of the whole House, where people can really hash out the technicalities and go through sort of, part by part or clause by clause and pull it apart and make sure that it's working to do what it should. And the new government came in for a bit of criticism for doing some of this for the repeal legislation. They repealed the water services entity legislation, the not as yet in effect resource management replacement legislation. I had some sympathy for them doing that, repealing the fair pay agreement legislation as well, because the arguments for repealing are simply the arguments that they advanced against passing. Nothing's changed on either score.
And very clearly flagged in the campaign on those ones too. So
in the campaign, there was a mandate for repealing all these things, but especially because for many of them it was two or more of the coalition parties. I think they all said they'd repeal the fair pay agreement stuff. I think they all said they'd repeal the RMA replacement stuff. I think they all said they'd repeal Three Waters. So there you can say, look, there is a democratic mandate. There aren't really that many technicalities around it, although there sort of are administratively for Three Waters and also the RMA stuff. But, you can sort of see the argument there. Here, I think they might be taking it a little far now. There, even with the legalization of pseudoephedrine again, so that you will be able to buy it over the counter. fantastic, support it wholeheartedly. Probably did need a bit more than 1 day for people to be able to make submissions on it. It is a substantive law change. I think everyone knows their positions on it, or not a law change, but, classification change. And you would think you could probably go through the normal process for this. There doesn't seem to be any harm in doing the normal process, and there seems to be sort of some potential for error, if you start railroading substantive things in through all stages of urgency. So I think they've probably gone a little far here.
And then the smoke-free reversal stuff too, Annabelle, that wasn't talked about in the campaign. That was a bit of a surprise. And that, among other things, come in the form of the 100-day plan, which is obviously a really useful device if you're looking to signal some urgency, both to the public service and to the public, and to kind of set yourself a deadline. But it's almost become something akin to as if it's a constitutional convention or something, which it really isn't. It's a made-up thing. What did you make of all of the activity last week?
Well, like Ben says, every time this happens at the start of a new parliament, a new government, the opposition always rails against it and says it is unfair. This time, though, there is actually numbers to back it up. There's a study that's been done, some analysis that shows urgency is usually used to pass about 10 bills during a parliamentary term, and in this case it's been somewhere between 14 and 16 bills that have been passed literally just in the first couple of weeks of Parliament. So, there's fair criticism there. As deplorable as many people will feel that it is that the government has used urgency to disestablish the Māori Health Authority, and there were some really passionate speeches in the House last week, including by Willow Jean Prime against it. It is an issue that the government brought into the election, that they campaigned on, that they have been very vocal on, and the National Party does have a very clear mandate. But I would say that when it comes to bills like the pseudoephedrine bill, which is being brought forward by ACT only won 8% of the vote in the last election, so I don't think that they could make an argument that they have a clear mandate for that legislation, and therefore having a proper parliamentary process around it is, should be something that we can all expect to happen. Similar with the tobacco rollback, this is a New Zealand first piece of legislation. It wasn't fully debated and discussed and campaigned on in a way that most people might expect. And again, they only got 6% of the vote. So I think when you're passing pieces of legislation where there isn't strong public support, and you're bypassing all of the mechanisms that we have in this country to make good law, that's deeply unsettling. And, funnily enough, you could say that this government is the antithesis of the last government, because the last government, although they got some stuff done in the first 100 days, they took so long to pass legislation that it's made it so easy for this government to swoop in. I'm sure that people in the media industry would like the fair news trading, digital trading bill to be passed under urgency. Certainly there's a need for it, as we see with the collapse of Newshub, but instead it's being used to bring pseudoephedrine back into our communities. It's strange.
And you mentioned, Annabelle, the speech by Willow Jean Prime. Chris Hipkins was also quite impassioned. There was a good speech from Chloe Swarbrick. Did the opposition find their feet a bit in that week, do you think?
I think there were some really compelling speeches delivered in the House, but probably more could have been done afterwards to keep the momentum rolling and create a bit of a narrative that people could latch onto about what was happening in Parliament last week. So, great to be good in the House, but you kind of need the follow-up outside of the House because not everyone is sitting around watching Parliament TV.
Yeah, I wondered that too, Ben, whether the opposition missed a trick in terms of kind of calling it something or other weak and, tying a bow on it and saying this is the character of the government you're dealing with, so on and so forth. The sort of somehow, even if it's coming together across those three parties of opposition and creating that dreaded word, the narrative, in order to cast it, tie it together as something that sums up the government as a whole.
Yeah, I think they're making a reasonable effort on the individual issues. I think it's probably, my suspicion is it's probably a good idea for Labour to, in terms of, I think we talked about this a few weeks ago, not barking at every car. Right now you'd say there are many, it's a motorcade. There are a lot of cars to bark at because of the sort of quixotic nature of the coalition agreements. But I don't know if the Māori Health Authority is a winner for Labour. I think that the Māori Party and the Greens, Māori Party in particular, really kind of dominate that space. Once you get beyond the slogans and you have to actually explain what you're losing with the Māori Health Authority, because it was so new, because it had some pretty poor evaluations, because it was still really kind of trying to find its feet and not even getting money out the door, it's hard to articulate what you've actually lost or what the impact is. So I don't necessarily think it's too bad for Labour to make some noises, get Willow Jean primed up, so to speak, but to kind of otherwise let it go through to the keeper. I think they, at this stage in particular, they'll get further just go with things like Premier House and the housing allowance.
The other kind of big story of the week last week, Annabelle, was the shock announcement that Newshub will close in June, that Warner Brothers Discovery says it can no longer stomach the losses from the news operation, the entire news operation, and a good chunk of local programming beyond the news operation is going to come to an end, which is kind of shocking obviously, it's not, I don't think, too self-indulgent to say that all of us have friends and colleagues who work there, and so on a personal level, it's really awful for a large group of people, 250, 300 people. It's also a political issue or a democratic issue when you, at a stroke, remove, I don't know, something close to maybe a quarter or a fifth of the media output of the country. You return to a scenario likely which we haven't seen since 1989. And one which is kind of astonishing in a first world country to have only one major TV news operation, and for that to be owned by the state.
Yeah, and that's before we talk about how important TV3 has been in terms of Māori journalism, Māori broadcasting. They were the ones who commissioned, the first to commission Pūkana, one of the most influential Māori language children's shows in Aotearoa. The countless number of Māori cameramen and editors that came through their ranks, being Whakaata Māori's first partner. When Māori television was set up, TVNZ didn't want to know us, didn't want to give us access to their news library. So, and they joined forces with Whakaata Māori. They commissioned the hui. So they've done a lot over the years, not just in terms of plurality of voice and including diverse voices. But yeah, it's actually not shocking. This has been on the cards for a long time. It's no secret that, right from the time basically that they lost Home and Away as their lead-in show for the news, that it's been really tough going at TV3, and they have innovated in every way possible. So for the response from the government to be that it was about a lack of innovation, just really smacks hard, because they've actually done an incredible job of innovating, and it's a real concern when we only have one big player where everything is, all of the mechanisms are in their favour, and you have this warped media landscape that we do. At the same time, the government can't bail out Warner Brothers Discovery. This is a huge, multinational company, but I think what they could have done, hindsight is 2020. But when they were buying that company, there should have been a requirement that they are only allowed to do business in this country if they are providing a news service. And why that wasn't built into the agreement when they bought 3, I don't understand why.
Well, that's right. 3 was saved at one point. I think I saw Maurice Williamson reminding us that he pushed through some legislation which allowed foreign companies to buy bandwidth in broadcast bandwidth in New Zealand. So it's interesting that was. There are a lot of countries whereby there are quite particular rules about foreign ownership of media outlets. There's also, when you talk in terms of TVNZ, the loss of competition, which is such an important kind of driving factor. People who remember those days say how much TVNZ lifted its game and that's just the nature of things, and we all do that in our own ways. I would commend people the latest edition of the Fold podcast, in which Duncan Grieve talks to Mark Jennings, who of course was at TV3 MediaWorks for decades, and now at Newsroom. It's a really fascinating discussion about what we stand to lose. There's also attention put on the political response, and Melissa Lee had a full 15 hours and overnight to think about it, and then managed to come out and look remarkably unempathetic, seemed to imagine that Sky News was a separate organisation rather than the fantastic Eric Young fronted service being provided by Newshub, so that's endangered too. And just sort of not really kind of – Joe Moyer on RNZ this morning said that some ministers seemed like they needed to turn their political radar off and on again, and it seemed to be an example of that.
It's interesting because for a long time I think the industry has looked at Melissa Lee as the minister in waiting. She is someone who performed very well in opposition as the broadcasting spokesperson, seemed very much across the portfolio, asked lots of tough questions in select committee, all of that stuff. And
has a history.
Has a history. And when she was appointed broadcasting minister, I think there was a lot of goodwill in the industry towards her, and that she was someone who was looked upon as really understanding and knowing the industry very well. So for her to have responded to this crisis, it is a crisis in New Zealand journalism, so poorly, I think has really surprised a lot of people in the industry. And, the thing is that we don't know what the government's broadcasting agenda is. There's been no communication or,
no policy,
no blueprint laid down. So, it kind of feels like everyone's sort of scrambling around in the dark trying to find the light switch.
Ben, your view on the response from the government? It seems to have been really one of just kind of keep your head down and try and avoid the storm.
Yeah, and it could be because they don't really know what to do, more broadly. I mean, in particular, Annabelle's right. You can hear there's a strong case for, subsidizing journalism, state-funded journalism. That was what the somehow controversial BIJF was about. But of course, when it comes down to subsidizing individual organizations, is that the game? Is that, should there be regulation, or should there be a deal with government that, the organizations that exist now are the ones that should be propped up forever? The Spinoff is only 7 years old. Newsroom is what?
9.5.
9, sorry.
Nearly
9
10.
years, yes. Newsroom's about 6 or 7 years old, And so how do you sort of navigate that? What's the cutoff in terms of size? And in terms of also, this is actually in terms of plotting their way forward. This is one of the areas where we will see the tension between, the kind of centre-right but very centrist National Party that is nonetheless very constrained by money concerns right now. ACT, which is very hands-off, free market, deregulatory. You've just seen David Seymour, who is as Associate Finance, acts as the shareholding minister for Cordia and for TVNZ. He's floated. Why do we make it so easy for TVNZ? They don't have to return a dividend. So maybe it's turn the screws on them. That'll help competition
because they're fine.
And New Zealand First, they are much more interventionist. Now, obviously, Winston Peters has his own sort of issues with journalists and journalism, but there was actually quite a bit of stuff about government support for the industry in their manifesto. I mean, there's all sorts of fucking shit in their manifesto.
Well, and over the years,
it was interesting to see that Peters was able to give far more empathetic responses that seemed, very genuinely invested in the outcome than what Melissa Lee did. I don't understand why she didn't say something like, very saddened to hear the news. I've asked for a meeting with Warner Brothers Discovery. We'll be looking at what we may be able to do to support them. And in the meantime, we really look forward to hearing the submissions on the digital fair trading bill, whatever it's called. Like, it's not very hard to come up with an appropriate response. When it's Winston, the arch enemy of the media, who's actually being the good cop in this situation, you're like, wow, this is not playing out how I expected it to.
He does have almost the quintessential love-hate relationship, doesn't he, with the media? I mean, he hates them and he loves the media, and it's the same. It's two sides, the same coin, really.
Yeah, that's right. I mean, Winston couldn't do this theatre without the stage, which is the media, right? Whereas Melissa Lee, I think, should be fine with never being on camera again.
Yeah, that
right?
would be that would be okay. Yeah, they could just issue press releases, and I mean, I don't see what the problem is. The press releases appear on scoop.co.nz. Is that not enough for people of New Zealand? The fair digital news bargaining bill you mentioned, Annabelle, this does kind of place a little bit of extra attention on that, a bit more urgency in the lowercase u sense. Melissa Lee had said she was opposed to it. She's now sort of sounding a bit more ambivalent. She wants to hear what the select committee come up with. My guess is that they will add in some stuff about AI, rightly, in terms of particularly AI's, feeding on the great media output in order to serve its own generative capabilities. Willie Jackson, interestingly, has been kind of more vocal and more visible in the absence of Melissa Lee, but he also has looked a little bit sheepish in terms of not having pushed this bill through earlier, which they really could have done. Do you think this has got now more legs than it did before? Well,
I think before most people just didn't care about it because they didn't see it as having any impact on them. But, the loss of TV of Newshub, and which is just the start, others will follow. We know that there's all sorts of distressed platforms all across the industry. As those begin to fold, people realise that it actually does have a very real impact on them when they're not able to get access to the news they care about. So I do think it'll put new emphasis on the bill again, and probably more sympathetic ears from the public, bit more emotional investment from the public in the outcome of this.
Okay, before we go, a quick word on Grant Robertson. Some weeks ago, he announced he would be standing down. Did he put a date on it? I can't remember. It's maybe the end of the month, and then he's going to have a couple of months off, and then he's going to take up the role of Vice-Chancellor at the University of Otago, where at last he will be paid properly. having had to struggle through, he'll be getting something like 600K, which is incredible. But there we go, big job there. Takes on university in a bit of peril with a lot of debt. Good luck to him. But what he leaves, Ben, is quite a hole in that he's been an integral part of that Labour machine all the way back, really, to the Helen Clark years, where I think he was sometimes referred to jokingly as H3, because of course it was Helen Clark, Heather Simpson, H1 and H2, and he was, he's famously credited with having R2D2? Coming up with the student loan. He was R2D2 coming up with the student loan thing in the 2005 election, and also had this a massive influence, both in opposition and in government. He came within a whisker of the leadership in 2 races in opposition, on both occasions being supported by the caucus, but losing out thanks to union support falling the other way. In the second one, I think he lost by like 0.5% or 1% or something to Andrew Little. And then he had an opportunity, of course, to be the leader when Jacinda Ardern decided to stand down, but he too was, having gone through that whole COVID period, no longer had, I guess, the gas in the tank. So it's an interesting story. I kind of, not to necessarily over-dramatise it, but I feel there was a certain tragedy in watching him in the lead up to the election when we had his income insurance policy got thrown on the bonfire, the wealth tax, or the tax switch that he and David Parker favoured, got ditched while Chris Hipkins was in Lithuania, I think. And then finally he had to stand there and through clenched teeth say, I've had I've had a road to Damascus moment on GST on fruit and vegetables, and what I called a boondoggle and a joke is now actually a very good policy. What's your assessment, Ben, of Grant Robertson's contribution also as finance minister through that difficult period and the gap he leaves?
Yeah, I think that will end up being his legacy, similar to Ardern, his performance during COVID, where he moved swiftly. He and the government moved very swiftly to keep the economy afloat, things like the wage subsidy. Very easy to criticize these things in hindsight in terms of the sort of scattergun approach, but you got to remember that we were in a period where Treasury were making estimates about GDP impact, and they said they didn't even know how to approach it. They were just sitting down with spreadsheets and crossing out whole lines of the economy, like tourism and
there were predictions that we could see unemployment of 10%, for example,
30% drop in GDP, that kind of thing. And while it was catastrophic for some people, particularly self-employed government relations and PR people early on, the economy, actually, did okay. We preserved all the jobs. In the end, there was actually, ridiculous construction inflation because they probably, over-temped it in terms of, shovel-ready projects and things like that. So, look, he deserves credit for that. Those hard calls that were made at the beginning were, some of the most consequential in New Zealand political history. But yeah, as you said, in terms of the legacy that he probably thought that he would be leaving, not just when he became the finance minister, not just when he was finance minister, but for most of his probably adult life. Probably not the legacy that he was hoping for. Did not manage to get the sort of structural change that Michael Cullen did, with things like KiwiSaver, the super fund, working for families. Did succeed in increasing benefits. He would take personal satisfaction in that. There was a big increase there, big increases in the minimum wage. Was a reasonably careful custodian of the books for about the first 2 years, and then under COVID just sort of really let it go and continued on that path. So, yeah, very mixed legacy. Labour, in politics, we talk probably a little too much about sort of political skills and political management skills at the expense of, substantive achievements. But at the same time, I think what Labour will miss the most about Robertson is his political management skills. They don't have anyone as adept as him left. He really was an exceptionally good political operator. And I think in terms of trying to run attacks on the new government, they will be a bit at sea without him.
Well, the proof is in the pudding, isn't it? And all the financial rating agencies say that he did a superb job. I feel aroha for Robertson. I think it would be interesting to imagine what his legacy may have been if we hadn't have gone through COVID, and what New Zealand might be like today if we hadn't have gone through COVID. I do think he missed some tricks. I think, before they were elected government, him and Carmel Sepuloni had made commitments to forgive Wynn's debt accrued through emergency housing and that sort of thing, which he never followed through on. I think, some of that money spent on hammer-ready and shovel-ready projects probably could have gone in that direction. But overall, I think he did a pretty remarkable job in an extraordinary period in this country. And I think as time goes by, his legacy will be looked upon more and more favourably, and we'll realise that a lot of the criticism against him and the way he managed the economy during COVID is very much unwarranted.
Yes, I mean, my view on this is, as on so many things, is time will tell. Sometimes I also say the jury's still out on that one. That's another thing that I say, another thing I like to say.
That's profound.
But no, it's true. It also has to be judged in the international context, doesn't it? It will take some time to be able to make an assessment, and needs to be considered compared to countries in similar positions and their responses overall. All right, look, that's good. Just leaves us to get to finally, Ben, where are you at on the percentage on your computer?
28%.
Oh, wow. That was easy. Yeah. We could go another hour. Should we go another hour?
Yeah.
Oh, no. T.I. is shaking his head furiously. He's
ready to do another podcast. I'm going to log into Caucus with RNZ. Jump in on them.
Yes, good. Thank you all. Thanks, Ben. Thanks, Annabelle. Thanks, T.I. here, and talk soon.